The coffee was terrible, but then again, 3-year-old military rations weren't exactly known for their gourmet appeal. Thomas Kane sipped the bitter liquid and stared at the sensor array he'd cobbled together from mining equipment and salvaged ship parts, watching the steady green blips that represented absolutely nothing happening on the surface of Kepler 442c. Which was exactly how he liked it. The abandoned mining complex had become his world, a maze of tunnels and chambers carved deep into the planet's crust, far enough underground to avoid the automated security drones that still patrolled the surface like mechanical vultures. The corporate wars had ended 3 years ago, but nobody had bothered to tell the machines. They kept their vigil over a dead world, protecting assets that no longer existed for companies that had been absorbed or destroyed in the fighting. Kane adjusted the frequency on his makeshift radio, cycling through the standard emergency channels out of habit more than hope. Static filled the air, punctuated by the occasional burst of encrypted corporate traffic from passing ships. He'd stopped trying to decode the messages months ago. There was never anything about amnesty programs or pardons, just routine cargo manifests and navigation data from a galaxy that had moved on without him. Another exciting day in paradise, he muttered to the empty room, his voice hoarse from disuse. He'd taken to talking to himself more frequently lately, if only to make sure his vocal cords still worked. The human brain wasn't designed for this level of isolation. But then again, humans weren't designed for a lot of things they ended up doing anyway. The mining complex's main shaft stretched down nearly 2 kilometers, with dozens of lateral tunnels branching off into work areas, equipment storage, and living quarters. Kane had claimed a section on level 12, deep enough to avoid detection, but close enough to his improvised workshop that he could maintain the life support systems that kept him breathing. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent years learning to kill people efficiently, only to discover his real talent was keeping ancient machinery functioning with spare parts and stubbornness. His daily routine had achieved a kind of mechanical perfection over the past 3 years. Morning sensor sweep, equipment maintenance, inventory check, perimeter patrol through the upper tunnels, afternoon scavenging on the surface if the drone patrol schedules permitted, evening meal of reconstituted protein paste, and then the long hours before sleep when he tried very hard not to think about anything at all. Today's sensor sweep was yielding the usual results. No life signs, no energy signatures, no indication that anything more interesting than cosmic radiation was visiting his little corner of the universe. The mining drones had been quiet for weeks, their programmed routes apparently satisfied that no unauthorized personnel were disturbing the corporate assets they were protecting. Which was technically true, since Kane had been very careful to only steal things that were already broken. He was reaching for another cup of the wretched coffee when the sensor array began chiming with an alert tone he hadn't heard in months. Kane leaned forward, studying the display with the focused attention that had once made him one of the Earth Defense Force's most effective tactical officers. 3 objects, moving in formation, approaching from the outer system at sublight speeds. Too small to be military vessels, too purposeful to be random debris. "Well, that's interesting," Kane said, his fingers automatically moving over the controls to refine the sensor focus. The objects were organic in composition, definitely ships, but using technology that didn't match any corporate or military designs in his database. They were also moving with the kind of desperate efficiency that suggested they were running from something rather than exploring. Kane pulled up the long-range communication array, another of his jury-rigged creations that could monitor traffic across multiple frequency bands simultaneously. For the first time in weeks, there was chatter on the military channels, encrypted bursts of data that his equipment couldn't decode, but which carried the unmistakable urgency of a pursuit in progress. He leaned back in his chair, studying the tactical situation with professional interest despite himself. 3 unknown vessels, possibly damaged based on their erratic energy signatures, being pursued by what appeared to be a Dominion hunter-killer squadron. The approaching ships were heading directly for Kepler 442c, which meant they were either very lost or very desperate. Given that this system was officially listed as a hazardous navigation zone due to the automated defenses, Kane was betting on desperate. "This is where I mind my own business," he told himself firmly, watching the sensor contacts continue their approach. "This is where I stay invisible and let whatever's happening happen without me." But even as he said it, Kane was running tactical calculations in his head. The planet's orbital mechanics would bring the unknown ships into the shadow of the larger moon in approximately 6 hours, providing temporary cover from pursuit sensors. If they were smart, and if they were still functional, they would use that window to attempt repairs or establish a defensive position. The mining complex where Kane had made his home sat in a natural crater that would provide excellent cover from orbital scans, surrounded by the twisted wreckage of industrial equipment that would confuse sensor sweeps. If someone wanted to hide on Kepler 442c, they could do worse than landing in his backyard. Kane stood and moved to the weapon locker he'd built into the wall of his quarters. 3 years of careful maintenance had kept his military equipment in perfect condition: assault rifle, sidearm, tactical armor, field medical kit, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. He told himself it was just routine maintenance, force of habit, but now he had to admit he'd been preparing for exactly this kind of situation. The sensor array chimed again, and Kane saw that the pursuing Dominion forces had increased their acceleration. Whatever those 3 ships were carrying, someone wanted it badly enough to chase them into a dead system protected by automated kill zones. "Not my problem," Kane repeated, but his hands were already checking his weapons automatically. "I'm retired, I'm invisible, I'm nobody." The lead unknown vessel suddenly changed course, breaking formation with its companions and diving toward the planet's surface with the desperate trajectory of a ship whose engines were failing. Kane watched the sensor track with growing fascination as the vessel's course brought it directly toward the mining complex. "Oh, come on," he muttered, recognizing the inevitability of what was about to happen. "Out of all the places on an entire planet, you have to crash in my neighborhood." The ship's energy signature was fluctuating wildly now, and Kane could see that it wasn't going to make a controlled landing. Whatever was aboard that vessel was about to become his problem, whether he wanted it or not. 3 years of careful isolation were about to end in the most dramatic way possible. Kane grabbed his equipment pack and began the long climb to the surface, telling himself he was just going to observe the crash site and make sure the wreckage didn't compromise his position. He certainly wasn't planning to get involved with whoever or whatever had just brought a Dominion pursuit squadron to his doorstep. But as he climbed toward the surface access tunnel, Kane found himself checking his weapons one more time, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something that might have been anticipation stirring in his chest. Maybe retirement was overrated after all. The ship came down like a meteor with anger management issues, carving a blackened furrow through the twisted remains of processing equipment, before slamming into a crater that had once housed atmospheric processors. Kane watched from his concealed observation post 300 meters away, counting the secondary explosions and mentally calculating how long it would take the orbital debris to stop raining down on his home. "Well," he said quietly, "that's definitely going to show up on somebody's sensors." The vessel was unlike anything in his database. Organic curves blended seamlessly with what appeared to be crystalline technology, and despite the violent crash, it was still largely intact. As the smoke cleared, Kane could see that the hull was actually repairing itself. Microscopic nanites or biological processes sealing breaches and restoring structural integrity. Definitely not human technology, and probably not Dominion either. Movement near the wreckage caught his attention, and Kane adjusted his field glasses to get a better look. 5 figures emerged from what must have been an emergency hatch, moving with the careful coordination of trained soldiers despite their obvious injuries. As they moved into the light, Kane realized they were all female, humanoid but distinctly alien, tall, graceful, with elongated ears that tapered to elegant points. Etherians. Kane recognized the species from his military briefings, though he'd never encountered them personally. They were supposed to be neutral in the ongoing conflicts between human factions, more interested in exploration and scientific research than military conquest. So what were 5 Etherian warriors doing being chased by Dominion hunter-killers? Through his observation scope, Kane watched them establish a defensive perimeter around their crashed vessel with professional efficiency. The leader, distinguished by slightly more elaborate armor, and the way the others deferred to her commands, was conducting a tactical assessment of their position while directing the others to salvage what they could from the wreckage. Kane's enhanced audio pickups caught fragments of their conversation, translated by his suit's linguistic processors into something approaching comprehensible English. What he heard made his blood run cold. The data core is intact, but we'll need at least 12 hours to establish a communication link with the resistance cell on Ethereal Prime. Dominion forces will be in system within 6 hours, if they detect our crash site. Last chance to warn our people about the orbital bombardment platforms, if this intelligence doesn't reach command. Kane lowered his field glasses, feeling a familiar weight settling in his stomach. These weren't random refugees or lost explorers. They were carrying intelligence about a Dominion military operation, and if what he'd overheard was accurate, it involved orbital bombardment of civilian targets. The same kind of operation he'd refused to participate in 3 years ago, when following orders would have meant glassing a colony world full of noncombatants. His tactical mind was already working the problem despite his conscious desire to stay uninvolved. The Etherians had picked a defensible position, but they didn't know about the automated mining drones that would detect their energy signatures within hours. They also didn't know about the subsurface tunnel network that Kane had been mapping for 3 years, or the cache of Dominion military equipment he'd been accumulating from crashed corporate security vessels. Not my problem, Kane muttered, but he was already plotting approach routes that would avoid the Etherian sensor coverage while giving him access to supplies they would need. I'm invisible. I don't exist. I definitely don't help people who are about to bring an entire Dominion squadron down on my head. The youngest of the group, barely more than a teenager by Etherian standards, suddenly collapsed near the ship's hull. Kane watched through his scope as the others rushed to her aid, and his military medical training automatically cataloged the symptoms. Plasma burn, probably from damaged ship systems during the crash. Without proper treatment, she'd be dead within hours. Kane's hand moved unconsciously to the medical kit attached to his equipment harness. He had enough supplies to treat her injuries, along with antibiotics that would work on Etherian physiology. It would mean revealing his position and abandoning 3 years of careful invisibility, but it would also mean the difference between that girl living or dying. "Damn it," he whispered, recognizing the moment when good intentions collided with survival instincts. Kane began moving through the wreckage field, using skills he'd hoped never to need again. Ghost tactics, the ability to move through hostile territory without leaving trace evidence or triggering detection systems. He'd learned them fighting Dominion Black Ops teams in the corporate wars, and now he was using them to avoid detection by the people he was trying to help. His first priority was the automated security systems. The mining drones operated on predictable patrol routes, but the Etherians' energy signatures would trigger proximity alerts within the hour. Kane reached the primary control node through an access tunnel the aliens couldn't have known existed, and began the delicate process of modifying the patrol algorithms without completely shutting down the systems that concealed his own presence. 20 minutes of careful programming later, the security grid would register the crash site as geological anomaly requiring extended analysis, buying the Etherians at least 8 hours before automated systems flagged their presence. Not perfect, but it would have to do. Next came supplies. Kane had been stockpiling equipment from crashed corporate vessels for 3 years, more out of habit than need. Medical supplies, ration packs, power cells, and communication equipment. Everything a stranded military unit might require to survive until rescue arrived. He began the careful process of relocating these caches to positions where the Etherians would discover them while conducting standard reconnaissance sweeps. The medical supplies went first, placed in a cargo container near their defensive perimeter with enough damage to make it look like crashed debris rather than a planted supply drop. Kane watched through his scope as the Etherian medic discovered the container and immediately began using the supplies to treat the injured girl. The relief in their voices was audible even at his distance. Food and water came next, followed by power cells that were mysteriously compatible with Etherian technology. Kane found himself taking professional pride in his work. This was logistics and supply chain management at its finest, the kind of behind-the-scenes support that won wars but never made it into the official reports. By the time the Dominion pursuit ships reached the outer system, Kane had transformed the Etherians' desperate last stand into something approaching a defensible position. They had supplies, medical care for their wounded, and enough power to begin repairs on their communication systems. They also had a guardian angel they hadn't detected, which was exactly how Kane preferred his good deeds. The Etherian leader, Kane had started thinking of her as commander, based on how the others deferred to her judgment, was conducting another perimeter sweep when she paused near one of Kane's carefully placed supply caches. She knelt beside the container, studying the placement with tactical eyes that clearly recognized the difference between random debris and deliberate positioning. "Zara," she called softly to one of her companions, "either we're the luckiest crash survivors in the galaxy, or someone on this planet is helping us." But Kane smiled grimly from his concealed position. Military minds thought alike, regardless of species. Commander Zara had figured out that their good fortune wasn't entirely accidental, which meant it was time for Kane to get more creative about his assistance. The real test would come when the Dominion forces arrived. Kane's modifications to the security grid would hide the Etherians from automated detection, but human operators would spot them eventually. When that happened, Kane would have to decide whether 3 years of self-imposed exile was worth more than 5 alien lives and the intelligence they carried. Looking at the young Etherian who was now sitting up and taking her first solid food in days, Kane was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. The Dominion ships arrived with all the subtlety of a corporate audit, efficient, thorough, and absolutely convinced of their right to be there. Kane watched from his deep tunnel command center as 3 hunter-killer vessels took up orbital positions around Kepler 442c, their sensor arrays conducting systematic sweeps of the planet's surface. "Ladies," he muttered to himself, "you're about to find out why I've survived down here for 3 years. The Dominion fleet's commander was apparently someone who believed in overwhelming force and minimal patience. Within hours of achieving orbit, they had deployed atmospheric reconnaissance drones and established a surface base in the ruins of the main mining facility. Kane counted at least 40 troops, plus support equipment, and enough firepower to level what remained of the colony. Through his surveillance network, Kane monitored their communications and quickly identified the tactical situation. The Dominion forces knew the Etherian ship had crashed on Kepler 442c, but his modifications to the security grid were working. Their sensors were reading the crash site as a geological anomaly caused by recent tectonic activity. The deception wouldn't hold forever, but it was buying precious time. Time the Etherians were using well. Commander Zara had organized her people with impressive efficiency, turning their desperate crash landing into something resembling an organized military operation. They were conducting careful reconnaissance, rationing their supplies, and working to establish communication with their resistance cell. What they didn't know was that their mysterious benefactor was about to escalate his assistance in ways that would definitely void his insurance policy. The first Dominion patrol came within 50 meters of the Etherian position, close enough that Kane could see Commander Zara's hand tighten on her weapon through his surveillance scope. The patrol consisted of 6 soldiers moving in standard search formation, their equipment scanning for energy signatures and biological traces. Kane triggered the first of his surprises, a mining charge buried in the remains of a processing plant 300 meters away. The explosion wasn't large enough to cause casualties, but it was perfectly timed to draw the patrol's attention away from the crash site. While the Dominion soldiers investigated what appeared to be a delayed detonation from the old corporate wars, Kane activated a second surprise. The mining complex's industrial fabricators had been offline for 3 years, but Kane had spent considerable time learning to operate them. What the Dominion forces didn't know was that he'd been programming them to create very specific objects, replicas of corporate security equipment, complete with authentication codes and patrol schedules. When the fabricators suddenly came online and began producing what appeared to be legitimate security reports, the Dominion commander was faced with a tactical nightmare. The planet's automated systems were actively interfering with his operation. "Control, we're getting conflicting data from the planetary defense grid," came the voice of the Dominion patrol leader over Kane's intercepted communications. "The security systems are registering multiple false positives and suggesting alternative search zones." Kane smiled as he manipulated the fabrication systems to produce increasingly creative distractions. Fake geological surveys suggesting unstable ground in the area where the patrol had been searching. Environmental warnings about toxic gas pockets that required immediate evacuation. Even a fabricated report about rare mineral deposits that would require extended scientific analysis before military operations could continue. The beauty of corporate bureaucracy was that it created so much paperwork that adding a few more forms to the pile was almost undetectable. The Dominion commander was now dealing with 17 different regulatory compliance issues that Kane had generated using the mining complex's own administrative systems. While the Dominion forces wrestled with bureaucratic chaos, Kane moved to the next phase of his assistance program. The Etherians needed communication equipment capable of reaching their resistance cell, but their ship systems were too damaged to establish interstellar contact. Fortunately, Kane had been maintaining the mining complex's communication array for 3 years, upgrading it with salvaged military equipment whenever possible. Getting the Etherians access to the communication system required more direct intervention than Kane had attempted so far. He would need to establish physical contact with their position, which meant abandoning his carefully maintained invisibility. The decision was complicated by the fact that Kira, the youngest Etherian, was showing signs that her injuries were more serious than initially thought. Kane made his choice when he watched Commander Zara's tactical assessment through his surveillance network. She was planning a desperate assault on the Dominion surface base, hoping to capture communication equipment before her wounded team member died from plasma poisoning. It was a brave plan that would definitely get all of them killed. Time for the ghost to become visible. Kane's approach to the Etherian position was a masterclass in tactical infiltration. He moved through subsurface tunnels they couldn't have known existed, emerging from concealed access points that put him within meters of their defensive perimeter, without triggering any of their detection systems. When he finally revealed himself, it was by simply walking into their camp with his hands visible and his weapons secured. "Commander Zara," he said quietly, using the name he'd learned from monitoring their communications. "My name is Thomas Kane, and I believe you could use some assistance." The reaction was immediate and professional. 5 weapons trained on him within seconds, but no one fired without assessing the threat level. Kane approved of their discipline even as he calculated the tactical disadvantages of his position. "You're human," Commander Zara said, her voice carrying surprise but not hostility. "What are you doing on a dead world?" "Long story," Kane replied. "Short version is I live here. I've been helping keep you alive for the past day, and your medic needs to know that plasma poisoning in Etherians responds well to human military medical protocols if you have the right antibiotics." Kira was indeed showing symptoms of advanced plasma poisoning, and Kane's medical kit contained exactly the supplies needed to treat her condition. As he worked to stabilize the young Etherian, Kane found himself explaining his presence in terms that didn't quite reveal the extent of his surveillance capabilities, or his reasons for being on Kepler 442c. The Dominion forces are being delayed by administrative complications, he told Commander Zara as he administered treatment to her wounded soldier. But that won't last more than another 12 hours. If you need to establish communication with your resistance cell, I have equipment that can help. Why? Commander Zara asked, studying Kane with tactical eyes that missed nothing. Why risk exposure to help strangers? Kane considered the question while monitoring Kira's vital signs. The simple answer was that he recognized kindred spirits, soldiers fighting against impossible odds for something larger than themselves. The complex answer involved 3 years of isolation, guilt over past choices, and the gradual realization that some things were worth breaking cover for. Because, Kane said finally, sometimes the right thing to do and the smart thing to do are the same thing. And because I've spent 3 years hiding from the Dominion, maybe it's time I stopped running. Commander Zara's expression shifted as she began to understand the implications of Kane's presence. You're military, she said. Earth Defense Force by your equipment and bearing. What did you do to end up here? I refuse to follow orders that would have killed civilians, Kane replied, checking Kira's response to the antibiotics. The Dominion doesn't appreciate ethical flexibility in their military contractors. For the first time since the crash, Commander Zara smiled. Thomas Kane, she said, I think we're going to get along just fine. The communication array, buried 3 levels beneath the mining complex, had been Kane's lifeline to the outside universe for 3 years, though he'd mostly used it to monitor rather than transmit. Now, as he led 5 Etherian warriors through tunnels that had never appeared on any corporate survey, he found himself wondering if he'd been too conservative in his approach to exile. This is remarkable, Vera, the group's technical specialist, said as they descended deeper into Kane's hidden domain. The humans who built this facility understood defensive architecture better than our intelligence reports suggested. The humans who built this were paranoid corporate executives who expected to be shot by their own shareholders, Kane replied, guiding them through a checkpoint he'd armed with enough explosives to seal the tunnels permanently. Turns out they weren't paranoid enough. The main communication chamber was Kane's proudest achievement, a fusion of human engineering and salvaged alien technology that could reach anywhere in the galaxy with enough power. He'd built it partially from boredom, partially from professional habit, and partially because some part of him had never given up hope that someday he might need to call for help. Commander Zara studied the setup with professional appreciation. This could reach Ethereal Prime directly, she said, running calculations in her head. With our encryption protocols and your transmission power, we could establish real-time communication with Resistance Command. There's just one problem, Kane said, pulling up the power consumption charts on his improvised displays. A transmission to Ethereal Prime will require more power than I can generate without bringing the entire surface facility online. The moment we light up the primary reactors, every Dominion ship in orbit will know exactly where we are. Nea, the team's medic who had been quietly treating Kira's injuries, looked up from her patient. How long would we have between power-up and detection? Maybe 20 minutes if we're lucky, Kane admitted. Long enough to transmit your intelligence data, but not long enough to receive confirmation or establish ongoing communication. Lissa, whose reconnaissance skills had already impressed Kane during their journey through the tunnels, was studying the facility schematics he'd displayed. What about defensive capabilities? Could we hold this position long enough to complete the mission? Kane considered the question, mentally reviewing 3 years of defensive preparations he'd hoped never to use. The tunnel system has multiple choke points that could be defended by a small force. I've got enough supplies stockpiled to withstand a siege, and the industrial fabricators could produce additional equipment if we had time. But ultimately, we're talking about 5 Etherians and 1 human against 40 Dominion troops with air support. Those are not favorable odds, Commander Zara agreed, but her expression suggested she was calculating rather than giving up. unless we could somehow reduce the enemy force before they reached our position. Kane found himself grinning for the first time in months. Commander, I've been living in this facility for 3 years with nothing to do but think about how to defend it. If you're willing to take some risks, I might have a few ideas about evening those odds. The plan that emerged from their tactical discussion was ambitious, dangerous, and relied heavily on the mining complex's industrial systems that the Dominion forces had dismissed as non-functional debris. Kane's 3 years of careful maintenance and creative modification had turned the abandoned facility into something that wouldn't have looked out of place in a military engineering manual. Phase 1, Kane explained, pulling up tactical displays that showed the surface facility and orbital positions. We use the mining drones to create a massive distraction. I've been reprogramming them for months. They can simulate the energy signatures of an active military installation, complete with defensive systems and troop movements. Vera studied the programming with growing excitement. This would convince the Dominion forces that they're facing a hidden military base rather than a crashed civilian vessel. They would commit their full strength to what they perceive as a legitimate military target. While they're dealing with fake soldiers and holographic weapons emplacements, we activate the communication array and transmit your intelligence data, Kane continued. But here's the interesting part. Once we've got their attention, we don't try to hide from them anymore. We make them come to us on our terms, through terrain we control completely. Kira, despite her injuries, was following the tactical discussion with keen interest. You're planning to turn this entire facility into a trap. More than that, Kane said, his expression growing serious. I'm planning to turn it into a statement. The Dominion destroyed my military career because I wouldn't participate in operations that targeted civilians. Now they're planning to do the same thing to your homeworld. Maybe it's time someone reminded them that soldiers are supposed to protect people, not slaughter them for corporate profits. The execution of their plan began 6 hours later, timed to coincide with the Dominion fleet's shift change, when their attention would be focused on routine operational procedures rather than tactical assessment. Kane activated the mining drone swarm first, sending dozens of automated units to the surface with programming that made them appear to be a military force establishing defensive positions. The Dominion response was immediate and overwhelming. Orbital bombardment began within minutes, targeting what their sensors identified as weapons emplacements, troop concentrations, and command facilities. The fact that they were destroying elaborately programmed decoys instead of actual military assets didn't become apparent until Kane activated the second phase of his plan. The facility's communication array came online with enough power to briefly outshine the system's primary star. The transmission to Ethereal Prime lasted exactly 14 minutes, long enough to deliver complete intelligence about the Dominion's orbital bombardment platforms and provide tactical recommendations for defending civilian population centers. Message confirmed received, Commander Zara reported, her relief evident despite the professional calm in her voice. Resistance Command is implementing planetary defense protocols based on your intelligence. You may have just saved millions of lives. Kane nodded, then activated the facility's defensive systems as Dominion assault shuttles began their descent toward the surface. Good, he said, checking the status of weapons systems he'd hoped never to use. Now let's make sure we live long enough to see whether it made a difference. The battle for the mining complex lasted 8 hours and became a textbook example of how superior tactics and defensive positioning could overcome numerical disadvantage. Kane's knowledge of the facility's layout, combined with the Etherians' advanced technology and tactical expertise, turned every corridor into a killing ground and every junction into a fortress. But the real victory came when intercepted Dominion communications revealed that their orbital bombardment platforms had been neutralized by Etherian resistance forces using the intelligence data Kane and his team had transmitted. The planned genocide of civilian populations had been stopped before it could begin. When the last Dominion soldier retreated to their assault shuttles, Kane found himself standing in the facility's main corridor with 5 alien warriors who had become something he hadn't expected to find again. A team he could trust, a mission he believed in, and a reason to be a soldier again. "The Dominion fleet is withdrawing," Lissa reported from her monitoring station. "Our transmission triggered a coordinated resistance response across 12 systems. They're facing organized opposition for the first time in years." Commander Zara approached Kane, her expression carrying something that might have been gratitude mixed with professional respect. "Thomas Kane," she said formally, "the Etherian Resistance would like to offer you a position as tactical advisor. Your expertise in asymmetric warfare and defensive operations could be invaluable to our cause." Kane looked around at the facility that had been his prison and his sanctuary for 3 years, then at the 5 women who had reminded him what it meant to fight for something bigger than survival. The choice should have been difficult, but it wasn't. "Commander," he said with a smile that felt unfamiliar after years of bitter solitude, "I thought you'd never ask, though I should warn you, I have a tendency to ask inconvenient questions about targeting civilians." "That," Kira said from where she was monitoring their repaired communication systems, "is exactly why we need you." The extraction ship that arrived 3 days later was sleek, fast, and equipped with technology that made Kane's improvised defenses look like children's toys. But as he prepared to leave Kepler 442c for the first time in 3 years, Kane realized he wasn't abandoning his exile. He was completing it. The broken soldier who had hidden in these tunnels was gone, replaced by someone who understood that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past, but about using it to build something better. "Ready to see what the galaxy looks like when you're fighting for the right side?" Commander Zara asked as they boarded the ship. Kane took one last look at the mining complex that had been his world, then sealed the airlock behind him. "Commander," he said, "I've been ready for 3 years, I just didn't know it yet."